You've been silent in meetings for months. You tell yourself it's because your English isn't good enough. You tell yourself you're being polite. You tell yourself someone else will say what you're thinking. But here's what's really happening. While you stay quiet, your colleagues are being promoted. They're leading projects. They're being asked for their opinions. Not because their English is better than yours, because they speak. And every time you stay silent, you're telling your manager, your team, and yourself the same message. I have nothing to contribute. That's not true, but that's what silence communicates. And today, we're going to fix this. Because the problem isn't your English. The problem is that no one taught you how Western meetings actually work. Part 1. The real cost of silence. Let me be very clear about something. This problem has nothing to do with your English level. I've worked with professionals who speak English fluently. They can write perfect emails. They can present slides when asked. They can have one-on-one conversations with no problem. But in live meetings, they freeze. Why? Because they don't understand how Western meetings actually work. Listen carefully. This is where most people get it wrong. In many cultures, staying quiet means respect. It means you're listening carefully. It means you're not pushing yourself forward. It means you're letting senior people speak first. These are good values. These values show humility and thoughtfulness. But in American, British, Canadian, and many European work cultures, silence means something completely different. Silence means you're not engaged. Silence means you don't care. Silence means you have no opinion. I know that sounds harsh, but I need you to understand this cultural reality, because if you don't understand this, you'll keep losing opportunities and you won't know why. Here's the rule. In Western business culture, active participation equals professional presence. If you're not participating, you're invisible. Let me give you a real example from someone I coached. Her name was Minji. She worked at a tech company in Toronto. She had been there for 2 years. She was a senior analyst, smart, hardworking, always delivered her work on time. But in meetings, she rarely spoke. She would listen, she would take notes, she would nod, but she almost never shared her opinion unless someone directly asked her. One day, her manager asked her to stay after a team meeting. The manager said, "Minji, I need to ask you something. Do you have opinions about the projects we discuss?" Minji was confused. She said, "Yes, of course." The manager said, "Then why don't you share them? I'm starting to wonder if you're really engaged with the team's direction." Minji was shocked. She thought she was being respectful. She thought she was showing that she trusted her colleagues. But her manager interpreted her silence as disengagement. This is not an isolated story. I hear versions of this story constantly. Now let me show you what happens over time when you stay quiet. 2 people, same skills, same experience, same job level. Person A speaks in meetings, asks questions, shares ideas, disagrees politely when needed. Person B stays quiet, listens carefully, nods, takes notes, only speaks when directly asked. 6 months later, Person A is leading a new project. Person B is still doing the same work. Why? Because when leadership thought, who should lead this, they remembered Person A's voice. They remembered their ideas. They remembered how they think. Person B? This is not fair. But this is real. And here's what makes this worse. You're not staying quiet because you have nothing to say. You're staying quiet because you don't know the structure of how to enter the conversation safely. You don't know when to speak. You don't know how to interrupt politely. You don't know how to disagree without sounding aggressive. You don't know how to add a point without feeling like you're taking up too much space. So you wait. You hope someone will ask for your opinion. And when no one does, you stay silent. And every week, every meeting, every silence, you lose a little more respect. Not because people think you're stupid, but because people stop thinking about you at all. Let me explain something else that's happening. In many Western work environments, meetings are where decisions get made, not after meetings. The people who speak during the discussion are the people who shape the decision. If you stay quiet, you're not part of that process. You might disagree with the decision. You might see problems with it. But if you don't speak up during the meeting, people assume you agree. Then later, when the decision turns out to be wrong, you can't say, "I knew that wouldn't work," because people will ask, "Then why didn't you say something?" And you won't have a good answer. This is what I mean when I say silence is costing you respect. It's not just about being heard. It's about being part of the decisions that affect your work. If you remember only one thing from this video, remember this. Your silence is not protecting you. It's erasing you. Now, I know some of you are thinking, "But Sarah, in my culture, interrupting is very rude. How can I speak without being disrespectful?" Good question, because that's exactly what we're going to solve right now. Here's what you need to understand. There is a way to enter conversations in Western meetings that is both assertive and polite. Native speakers do this every single day. They interrupt each other constantly, but they don't see it as rude. Why? Because they use specific phrases that signal respect while creating space to speak. These phrases are like permission structures. They soften the interruption while still claiming the floor. And once you learn these phrases, you'll realize something important. You don't need perfect English to participate in meetings. You need the right structure. I'm going to show you the exact structure native speakers use to enter conversations, ask questions that create presence, and disagree politely without damaging relationships. And you're going to see that none of this requires advanced vocabulary or perfect grammar. It requires strategy. Part 2. The 3 core skills. There are 3 communication skills you need to master if you want to stop being invisible in meetings. Skill 1. How to enter a conversation politely. Skill 2. How to ask questions that show engagement. Skill 3. How to disagree without damaging relationships. Let's start with the first one. Skill 1. How to enter a conversation politely. Here's the truth about interrupting. In Western meetings, interrupting is not automatically rude. I'll say that again because this is critical. Interrupting is not automatically rude. What's rude is how you interrupt. If you interrupt to take over the conversation, that's aggressive. If you interrupt to dismiss what someone just said, that's disrespectful. But if you interrupt to add value, to build on someone's idea, to ask a clarifying question, that's participation. That's engagement. Native speakers do this constantly. They don't wait for perfect silence. They create small openings and step in. Here's how you do it. First, you listen for a natural pause. When someone finishes a thought, when they take a breath, when they pause to think, that's your moment. Then you use a bridging phrase. The phrase is, "Can I add something here?" That's it. 5 words. Simple, direct, professional. You're not demanding attention. You're asking permission, but in a confident way. The key is your tone. You don't say it like a question where you're hoping they'll say yes. You say it with the expectation that they will listen. Let me give you the exact tone. Not, "Can I add something here?" High pitch, uncertain, but, "Can I add something here?" Steady, calm, confident. The difference is subtle, but people feel it. Here are 2 more phrases that work extremely well. "That's a good point. I'd like to build on that." This phrase does 2 things. First, it respects what the other person said. You're not dismissing them, you're acknowledging their contribution. Second, it signals that you're about to add value. You're not changing the subject, you're building on the discussion. One more. Before we move on, I want to mention one thing. This phrase is very powerful. You're creating urgency without being aggressive. You're saying, "If we don't talk about this now, we might miss something important." People will stop and listen. Now, let me show you what happens after you use one of these phrases. You've created space. People are waiting for you to speak. Now what? This is where many people panic. They think, "I need to say something brilliant right now." No. You just need to say your next thought clearly. Let me give you a complete example. You're in a meeting about launching a new product. Someone suggests launching in 3 months. People start agreeing, but you know the design team needs more time. You want to speak, but the conversation is moving fast. You wait for someone to finish their thought. Then you say, "Can I add something here? I'm concerned about the design timeline. If we launch in 3 months, we might not have time for proper user testing. Should we consider 4 months instead?" That's it. You've entered the conversation. You've made your point. You've offered a solution. You didn't need complex vocabulary. You didn't need perfect grammar. You just needed a clear structure. Now, here's what you need to understand about timing. You don't need to speak fast. You need to speak at the right time. And the right time is not when everyone is talking over each other. The right time is when there's a natural pause. Every meeting has these moments. Someone finishes a thought, people take a breath, the facilitator looks around to see if anyone has questions. That's your moment. And if you need a second to organize your thought after you've claimed the floor, that's completely fine. You can say, "Give me 1 second. I want to say this clearly." Native speakers do this all the time. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of thoughtfulness. People would rather wait 2 seconds for a clear idea than listen to someone ramble for 2 minutes. This is where most professionals get it wrong. They think they need a perfect sentence in their head before they speak. They don't. They just need a simple opening phrase. The rest comes after you've created the space. Let me give you another example. You're in a project review meeting. Your manager is explaining a new process. A colleague suggests a specific approach. You see a potential problem with it. You want to speak, but you're not sure if it's the right moment. Wait for the colleague to finish explaining their approach. Then, when there's a pause, you say, "That's an interesting approach. I'd like to add one consideration. If we do it that way, how will we handle the data migration? I think that might create delays. You've entered politely. You've framed your concern as a question. You've made people think about something they might have missed. This is how senior professionals communicate in meetings. They don't wait to be invited. They create their own openings. Now let me address a common fear. What if I speak and people ignore me? What if they just keep talking? This happens sometimes, even to native speakers. But here's what you do. If you start speaking and someone talks over you, you don't stop. You don't apologize. You continue. And if they keep talking, you use a stronger phrase. Hold on, I'm not finished. Say it firmly but not angrily. Just matter of fact. Most people will stop. And if they still don't stop, you wait for the next pause and you say, I started to make a point earlier. Let me finish it. This shows persistence, and people respect persistence. Skill 2. How to ask questions that show engagement. Now let's talk about a different skill. Many people think asking questions makes them look weak, like they don't understand, like they're slowing everyone down. This is completely wrong. In Western work culture, asking good questions is a sign of leadership. Let me explain why. When you ask a clarifying question, you're doing several things. First, you're showing that you're paying attention. You heard what was said, and you want to understand it fully. Second, you're helping the entire group. In most meetings, if you have a question, at least 3 other people have the same question. They're just not asking. Third, you're preventing mistakes. If something is unclear now, it will cause problems later. By asking now, you're saving time. So asking questions doesn't make you look weak. It makes you look thoughtful and strategic. But there's a right way and a wrong way to ask questions. Let me show you the wrong way first. Wrong. I don't understand. This is too vague. It doesn't help anyone. And it makes you look passive. Wrong. Can you explain that again? This is better, but it still puts all the work on the other person, and it suggests you weren't paying attention. Now let me show you the right way. Right. Just to make sure I'm following, are you saying that we're changing the timeline? This phrase is extremely effective. You're not saying, I don't understand. You're framing it as confirmation. It sounds thoughtful. It sounds strategic. It sounds like you're making sure everyone is aligned. Let me give you more examples. Can you clarify what you mean by accelerated process? Are we shortening the review phase or adding more resources? Notice the structure. You're asking for clarification, but you're also offering 2 possible interpretations. This shows you're thinking about it. Another one. When you say client-facing team, does that include the support team or just sales? You're asking a specific question. This shows you're thinking about implementation details. One more. Sorry, I didn't catch that last part. Could you repeat the timeline you mentioned? This is completely normal. Native speakers say this constantly. Meetings move fast. People speak quickly. Asking for repetition is not a sign of poor English. It's a sign of professionalism. Now let me show you something powerful. You can use questions to guide the conversation, even when you're not the meeting leader. Let me give you an example. You're in a meeting about a marketing campaign. People are discussing creative concepts, but no one has mentioned the budget yet. You're concerned that the ideas being discussed are too expensive. You can ask, "These are great ideas. Before we go further, what's our budget for this campaign?" This is a strategic question. You're not saying these ideas are too expensive. You're redirecting the conversation to an important factor that people forgot to discuss. This makes you look thoughtful. It makes you look like someone who thinks ahead. Your team is discussing a new feature for your product. People are excited about the idea, but you're not sure if customers actually want this feature. You can ask, "Has anyone talked to customers about this? Do we have data on whether this is something they're asking for?" Again, you're not saying the idea is bad. You're asking a question that makes people think more carefully. This is what senior professionals do. They use questions to shape discussions without being aggressive. Now, here's something important. After you ask a question, stay engaged. Don't just ask and then go silent again. If someone answers your question, you can respond. "That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying." Good to know. That helps me understand the direction. This creates a conversation. It shows you're not just asking questions to fill silence. You're asking because you're genuinely engaged. Here's the rule. Questions create presence. Silence creates absence. Every time you ask a thoughtful question, you remind people that you're thinking, you're analyzing, you're contributing, and that's exactly what creates respect. Skill 3. How to disagree without damaging relationships. Now we get to the skill that makes most people extremely uncomfortable. What do you do when you disagree with someone in a meeting, especially if that person is senior to you? This is where most people freeze completely. They think disagreement means conflict. They think it will damage relationships. They think it will make them look difficult or negative, so they stay silent, even when they know the decision is wrong. Let me be very honest with you. In Western work cultures, thoughtful disagreement is respected. I'll say that again because this is critical. Thoughtful disagreement is respected. It shows you're thinking critically. It shows you're invested in the outcome. It shows you're not just following orders blindly. Companies want people who can think independently. They want people who can spot problems before they become bigger problems. If you never disagree, people assume you're not thinking. They assume you're just going along with whatever is said. And those are not the people who get promoted. But here's the key. You need to know how to disagree without sounding confrontational. The difference between respected disagreement and confrontational disagreement is entirely in how you frame it. Let me show you the wrong way first. Wrong. That won't work. This is too direct. It sounds like you're dismissing the other person's idea completely. Wrong. I don't think that's a good idea. This is just your opinion without any logic. People will ignore it. Wrong. We tried that before, and it failed. This sounds like you're shutting down the conversation. Even if it's true, it doesn't help move things forward. Now let me show you the right way. Right. I have a concern about that approach. Can I share it? This phrase is perfect. You're not saying the idea is bad. And by asking, "Can I share it?" you're being respectful. You're asking for permission to offer a different perspective. Most people will say yes. And now you have the floor to explain your concern. Here's how you continue. I have a concern about that approach. Can I share it? If we launch without testing in the European market first, we might face regulatory issues that could delay everything. What if we piloted there before the full launch? Notice the structure. You stated your concern. You explained the risk. You offered an alternative. This is not confrontation. This is strategic thinking. Let me give you more examples. I see the logic, but I'm wondering if we've considered the impact on the client support team. They're already handling a high volume of requests. Will this increase their workload? This phrase is brilliant. You acknowledge the other person's reasoning first. I see the logic. Then you introduce a factor they may not have thought about. You're not saying they're wrong. You're saying there's something else to consider. That could work, but I'm a bit concerned about the timeline. We have 3 major deadlines in that same month. Do we have a backup plan if the team gets overwhelmed? You're not saying no. You're raising a risk. You're helping them make a better decision. One more. I want to build on that idea. What if we did it in 2 phases instead of all at once? That way we can test the first phase and adjust before the full rollout. This is very effective. You're not disagreeing directly. You're offering a modified version that addresses your concerns. This is how senior professionals communicate. They don't fight. They guide conversations toward better outcomes. Now let me show you what happens when you never disagree. People assume you have no critical thinking skills. They assume you're not paying attention. They assume you'll just do whatever you're told without questioning it. And when something goes wrong, people will wonder, why didn't anyone see this coming? And you'll know you saw it, but you didn't say anything. That's when you realize your silence didn't protect you. It made you complicit. Now let me address a specific situation that many people worry about. What if you disagree with your manager directly? This is where cultural differences create the most confusion. In many cultures, disagreeing with someone senior is deeply disrespectful. You don't do it publicly. Maybe you can mention it privately later, but never in front of others. But in many Western companies, managers actually want you to disagree with them in meetings. Because they want to make better decisions. They know they don't have all the information. They want input from the people who are doing the actual work. A good manager will respect you more if you disagree thoughtfully than if you just agree with everything. But again, it's all in how you frame it. Here's what you do. First, acknowledge their idea. Then, frame your disagreement as additional information they might want to consider. That's an interesting direction. I want to mention something that might affect the approach. Based on what I'm seeing from the data team, customer behavior has shifted in the last quarter. Should we factor that into the strategy? You're not saying they're wrong. You're offering information that might change their thinking. I appreciate the strategy you outlined. I want to raise one consideration. The engineering team mentioned they're at capacity right now. If we add this project, something else might need to be delayed. Should we discuss priorities? You're presenting a constraint they might not be aware of. You're helping them make a more informed decision. This is not disrespectful. This is exactly what managers need from their team members. Now, let me tell you what happens when you master this skill. People start seeing you differently. They start seeing you as someone who thinks strategically, someone who helps avoid problems, someone who makes discussions more productive. And that's exactly the kind of person who gets more responsibility, more visibility, and more opportunities. If you remember only one thing from this section, remember this: polite disagreement earns respect. Constant agreement earns nothing. Now, I want to talk about something even more important. Because speaking in meetings is only half the problem. The other half is making sure people actually listen when you speak. And that requires understanding something most people never think about. It's not just what you say. Part 3: How to make people listen when you speak. Here's something I see constantly. Someone finally speaks up in a meeting. They share an idea, and no one responds. The conversation just keeps moving, and that person thinks, "See, my English isn't good enough. People don't take me seriously." But that's not what happened. What happened is they didn't frame their idea strategically. Let me explain. It's not enough to have a good idea. You need to present it in a way that makes people care. Most people present ideas in the order they thought of them. They start with background information, then they explain their thinking, then they get to the main point. But by the time they get to the main point, people have stopped listening. In Western business communication, you need to do the opposite. You start with the main point. Then you give the reasoning. This is called bottom line upfront communication, and it's the standard in most Western companies. Wrong approach. So I was looking at the customer feedback from last quarter, and I noticed that a lot of people mentioned they had trouble with the onboarding process. And I was thinking that maybe we could improve the tutorial. Because I remember when I first used the product, I was also confused. And I think if we made it clearer, it might help retention. By this point, people have stopped listening. They don't know where you're going. They don't know if this is important or just an observation. Right approach. I think we should redesign the onboarding tutorial. Customer feedback shows it's a major pain point affecting retention. Here's what I'm seeing. Now people are listening. You told them the recommendation first. Now they want to hear the reasoning. This is how senior professionals communicate. They respect people's time. They get to the point. Your team is discussing a marketing plan. You think the plan is missing a key audience. Wrong. I think we should target young professionals. That's vague. It doesn't connect to the business goal. People will ignore it. Right. I think we should add young professionals in urban areas to our target audience. They have higher spending power, and they align with our premium product positioning. Based on the data from our recent campaign, this demographic has a 40% higher conversion rate. Should we test this segment? Now you've framed the idea with clear target, who, business logic, why, supporting data, proof, call to action. This is what makes people listen. Let me give you another example. You're in a meeting about project timelines. You think the deadline is too tight. Wrong? I think this is too fast. That sounds like a complaint. Right. I'm concerned about the timeline. If we compress the testing phase, we risk missing critical bugs. The last time we shortened testing, we had to do an emergency patch that cost us 3 days. Can we add 1 week to the testing phase? Now you've turned a complaint into a strategic recommendation. You've explained the risk. You've given a precedent. You've offered a specific solution. This is the difference between speaking and communicating. Speaking is just words. Communicating is logic plus intention. Now let me show you another powerful framing technique. When you want people to seriously consider your idea, connect it to something they already care about. Let me explain what I mean. Every company has priorities: revenue, customer satisfaction, efficiency, risk management. Every manager has goals: hit quarterly targets, reduce costs, improve team performance. If you can connect your idea to one of these priorities, people will listen. Let me give you an example. You want your team to adopt a new project management tool. But if you just say, "I think we should use this new tool," people might resist. Change is hard. People are busy. But if you say, "I found a tool that could reduce our project coordination time by about 30%. Right now, we spend a lot of time in status update meetings. This tool automates that, so we'd have more time for actual work. Can I show you a demo?" Now you've connected it to efficiency. You've shown how it helps them achieve their goals. Another example. You think your company should invest in better customer support training, but training costs money and time. If you just say, "We need better training," management might say, "We don't have budget for that." But if you say, "I've been analyzing our customer churn data. We're losing about 15% of customers in their first 3 months. Most of the feedback mentions support response quality. If we invest in support training now, we could reduce that churn. Even a 5% improvement would generate about $200,000 in retained revenue annually." Should we explore this? Now you've connected training to revenue. You've made it a business case, not just a nice-to-have. This is how strategic communicators think. They don't just share ideas. They frame ideas in ways that connect to business priorities. This is the difference between someone who speaks and someone who influences. Now let me address something else that's important. What do you do when you speak and people don't respond the way you expected? Maybe you shared an idea and no one reacted. Maybe someone interrupted you before you finished. Maybe someone dismissed what you said. This happens to everyone, even native speakers. But here's what you need to understand. Just because someone didn't respond doesn't mean your idea was bad. It might mean the timing was off. It might mean the group wasn't ready for that conversation yet. It might mean they need time to think about it. Don't assume silence means rejection. Sometimes people need to process information before they respond. Now, if someone directly dismisses your idea, here's what you do. You don't argue. You don't get defensive. You can say, "I understand that's not the direction you want to go. Can I ask what concerns you have about this approach? I want to understand your perspective." This keeps the conversation open. It shows you're not attached to being right. You're attached to finding the best solution. And sometimes, when you ask this question, you learn something valuable. Maybe they have information you don't have. Maybe there's a constraint you weren't aware of. Or maybe, when they try to explain their concern, they realize your idea actually makes sense. Either way, you've kept the conversation professional. Now let me talk about something that many people struggle with. What do you do when you've been quiet in meetings for a long time, and now you want to start participating more? You might worry that people will be surprised. You might worry that your first contribution needs to be brilliant. Let me tell you something. You don't need to start with a brilliant insight. You just need to start with presence. Here's what you do. In your next meeting, set one small goal. Just one. Your goal might be ask one clarifying question. That's it. Nothing more. You're not trying to solve problems. You're not trying to disagree with anyone. You're just going to ask one question that shows you're engaged. At some point in the meeting, someone will explain something, and you'll use one of the phrases I taught you earlier. Just to make sure I'm following, are you saying we're prioritizing the mobile version first? Simple, easy, low risk. You've participated. You've shown you're listening. You've created presence. The next meeting, you do it again. But this time, you add one more thing. Maybe this time you also agree with someone out loud. When someone makes a good point, you say, "That's a good point. I agree." That's it. 3 seconds. But now people heard your voice twice in the meeting. The meeting after that, you add one more thing. Maybe this time you add a small observation. "That's a good point. I agree. I'd add that the client team mentioned something similar last week." You're building slowly. You're creating a pattern where your voice is part of the meeting. And after about 3 or 4 meetings, speaking will start to feel normal, not scary. Because you've proven to yourself that nothing bad happens when you speak. People don't judge your English. They don't dismiss you. They just listen and move on. The fear was bigger than the reality. Now let me give you one final piece of advice. After each meeting, take 2 minutes to reflect. Ask yourself, did I speak? If yes, what went well? If no, why not? Was there a moment where I wanted to speak but didn't? What stopped me? What could I do differently next time? This reflection is how you improve, because you start to see patterns. Maybe you notice that you speak more easily in small meetings than large ones. Now you know what to work on. Maybe you notice that you speak more when you've prepared, but struggle in spontaneous discussions. Now you know you need to practice thinking on your feet. Maybe you notice that you speak up when discussing technical topics, but stay quiet during strategy discussions. Now you know where to build confidence. This self-awareness is what separates people who improve from people who stay stuck. Here's what I want you to remember. Your English is not the problem. The problem is that you're waiting for permission to speak. And in Western meetings, no one is going to give you that permission. You have to claim it yourself. You were hired for a reason. You're in that meeting for a reason. Your perspective matters. The only thing stopping you from being heard is the belief that you need to be perfect before you can participate. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be present. Everything I shared today, you can start using in your very next meeting. Pick one phrase, practice it once in your head, then use it. Can I add something here? That's all you need to start. And once you've said it once, it becomes easier the second time, and easier the third time. And after a few weeks, you'll realize something. Speaking in meetings isn't scary anymore. It's just part of your job. And the people around you will start seeing you differently. Not as the quiet person who never shares opinions, but as a strategic thinker, a valuable contributor, Someone who makes meetings more productive. That's the person who gets respect. That's the person who gets opportunities. And that person can be you, starting in your next meeting. That's all for today. Thank you for listening.